Donald Trump's problem with trying to be an autocrat continues. And polling shows he's having trouble here. He's sagging at 39%. The immigration outrage is part of that. The LA Times reports all of this taking a toll, with crashing trust in our elections, concerns about misuse of ICE and other federal agents. 30% of the voters think that immigration officials might be at polling locations, including a larger share of minority Americans. And that matters because the belief by 46%, say, of perfectly lawful Hispanic American or Latino American voters that ICE could be there could be a reason to skip, which goes to the propaganda war that's also being waged, what is sometimes called, depending on the situation, voter suppression. Here is also what Trump is saying.
Why would you want mail-in ballots if you know it's corrupt? It's a corrupt system. We're the only country in the world that has this system of mail-in ballots. Think of it. The only country in the world that has this system of mail-in ballots because they cheat.
Fact check, false. This, along with the fear that Bannon and others are putting out about ICE agents roaming voter polling locations, may be this effort to distort everything or to undermine trust in mail voting. There are entire states that do only vote by mail. The president's claim that it is, quote, corrupt is not backed up by the experience in states, and Donald Trump himself has netted many, many votes for him through the mail. Meanwhile, we have the pictures of the East Wing ballroom. You can see that going up. Turns out allies on the board are approving the project, rejecting concerns about the size of this building. There's also an appointment of an assistant to the panel in charge of reviewing the plans, which is coming out of Trump's team. And if you look past the White House, Trump has directed his Air Force to repaint a VIP fleet in his preferred palette, while putting up pictures and posters and renamings all over the place in the federal government, something the New York Times recently said was more akin to what you see in dictatorships than democracies. We're joined now by former White House attorney in the first Trump administration, Ty Cobb. Welcome back.
Thank you, Ari. Good to be with you.
What do you see here as important in the signal to noise? And this attack on the midterms is, in your view, propaganda, trying to distort who turns out, or also getting ready to do something?
So I think if we go to 30,000 feet and look at all the pieces, keep in mind Trump recently said that it was time to nationalize elections. He articulated publicly that he thought the federal government should interfere in 15 jurisdictions or more. Steve Bannon promised that ICE would be out in droves at key precincts and in key states. And that Trump even went so far as to suggest at one point that we should forget about elections in 2026. Now, the White House, with regard to the latter statement, said that was a joke, but it's not a joke. I mean, this is all intended to desensitize America and to discredit voting, and it's had a big effect. I mean, the polls show that voters don't really anticipate that the elections in 2026 will go smoothly or in a trustworthy manner, not because of mail-in ballots, but because of Republican interference and fascism suspected that will be at the polls. You've seen the judges, the courts on the immigration front have responded to the atrocities you have well mentioned and described on your show previously by revoking the presumption of regularity from the Department of Justice, that basically saying that after 250 years, what the Justice Department says is no longer entitled to the presumption of truth. We're seeing a real decline. And now you talk about the ballroom, which I think is probably less of concern than the fascist efforts that are being undertaken with regard to elections and elsewhere, immigration. But with regard to the ballroom, what would you see? Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed D.C. and renowned figure in American history, was one of the first people on the commission that you just mentioned. And now we have a very, very young woman who looks like she recently escaped from homeroom to have her braces removed, has no experience at all, and she's now a Trump appointee. Why? Because she's one of Trump's secretaries. So it's a kakistocracy, as the word that gets tossed around. I know it's a a word I didn't know well, but it means governance by the inept, and that's what we're suffering through.
Yeah, as you say, inept and nepotism and patronage carrying more weight than anything else, which, as you know, is also the opposite of what Trump had famously claimed in his campaigns. He said that because he was wealthy, he would have less corruption incentive, and it was really the public officials that you have to worry about. It's the opposite. I want to show you Kristi Noem, who at one point might have been fighting for her job over all the ICE outrage, and she at DHS getting involved in the voting discussion. Take a listen.
When it gets to election day, that we've been proactive to make sure that we have the right people voting, electing the right leaders to lead this country.
Is that the proper approach of a security official? And related, what is your legal view of the limits on ICE under current law to be out in a way that might be voter intimidation in any voting period when we get to the midterms?
So that's an excellent question. I think we're going to see the courts gradually parse through that. ICE actually has no local law enforcement authority in any of the states. They're only supposed to manage the limited number of federal crimes entrusted to them, and they shouldn't be there. But it's going to take a series of court battles, I think, to prevent them from being there, and it may come down to a conflict between state National Guards and ICE, absent an implication of the Insurrection Act, which I think we will see in advance of the election. So I think people should be very, very concerned and very, very animated about what's coming. Garry Kasparov, of course, has the noted Russian dissident and former world chess champion, has been very outspoken about the gulags that are being built around the country, and the fact that they're intended not only to house, illegally detained immigrants, of which we have thousands now, but also likely dissidents and people of color on a going forward basis. What is happening in this country?
And you don't think that's just an international parallel gone too far? You believe that's something that Trump would try to do and get away with?
So I'll put it this way, Trump is deporting people on a trajectory and at a pace that's not very different from the number of deportations that happened under Obama. However, the number of illegally detained people is extraordinarily high, and he's building dozens of prisons to house up to 8,000 people. We've never needed that before. That's well over 150,000 beds. Who are they for? And who are they going to be for when the detainees are gone? This is, as Garry Kasparov says, this is not a drill.
Some of the pushback we've seen on the election front, Virginia redistricting goes forward, but the Supreme Court's considering an appeal. Florida voters suing to block Republicans trying the mid-decade redistricting, something that may violate the tradition, and different courts are figuring out whether to allow that kind of constitutional hardball. Supreme Court is letting California use what is a Democratic-friendly congressional map, which in that state they won famously only pushing back on what MAGA had tried. How do you view that as a kind of a signal to what courts will do with what could be the more emergency problems on a faster basis going into the midterms that you were outlining?
So I think that the California decision by the Supreme Court is basically part and parcel of their decision in Texas, which they'd made earlier, allowing the Republicans to move forward with redistricting. And there's really no distinction between the two decisions and the reasoning, even though Trump, of course, championed the Texas redistricting, but criticized the California because it's Democrats and Republicans. That's not the way the country's supposed to be governed. It's supposed to be governed as a unified system of people for all the people. With regard to the other patchwork quilt of states, you have maybe 5 states, maybe 6 actually, with things in play. I think the reality there, though, is it's coming a little late in the game, and there will be appeals and delays, and that gets right up against the Supreme Court's precedent about they're not going to make changes late in the game. So I'm not sure how consequential any of these current efforts will be. And then you look at Trump's lies about, the perils of mail-in voting. I mean, Florida probably has the most mail-in votes of any state in the country. It's a Republican bastion. I don't think there's any basis for that. But the level of election interference isn't just in terms of the SAVE Act, which is, of course, just another fascist brick in the prison that's being built around us. But it's in what's going on in the Fulton County case. The Fulton County case where the feds went in and, notwithstanding legal proceedings in the state involving the same ballots, disrupted all that. Submitted an affidavit, which I don't know a single legal person who's reviewed the affidavit who believes that there's actual probable cause in there. In fact, the case agent who filed the affidavit noted that that he was basically relying on deficiencies cited by a Trump denier, Kurt Olson, a Trump election denier, Kurt Olson, who represented Carrie Lake in Arizona trying to contest her election, failed, and is flailed with a bunch of allegations that back in 2020, Bill Barr told Trump, were just false. So now he's recycling these, and the case agent pointed out that with regard to the allegations in the indictment, they could only be a crime if there was evidence, not citing evidence, but saying this is only a crime if there is evidence. And that is not the standard for issuing a warrant. So we're seeing a full-scale onslaught in the courts and the legislatures, and presumptively, based on what Trump has promised and Bannon has promised, we'll see ICE in the streets trying to intimidate witnesses and prevent the elections from going smoothly in blue states and key precincts.